So I have with me today Seraphim O'Keefe. He's been creating icons and church art since 2002. He began his studies in iconography while living in a monastery in the Republic of Georgia. He started working full-time as an iconographer in 2010. In 2012, he was invited to paint the walls of Holy Cross Orthodox Church in Linthicum, Maryland. Yeah. He completed the project in 2014 and moved to Midlothian, Virginia, to paint the sanctuary of St. Cyprian Orthodox Church. Seraphim originally apprenticed and worked as a fine artist from 2000 to 2009 under teachers in Russia and Georgia. His paintings have been displayed in shows and galleries in the U.S., Russia, and Georgia. Dr. Timothy Patitsas is the former interim dean of Hellenic College, assistant professor of ethics at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary, author of the book The Ethics of Beauty, and co-founder of Beauty First Films. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it very much. So,
Thank you.
First topic of discussion was actually postulated by my wife. So she asks, what are the overlaps between the practice of liturgical art and family life? How do those two spheres interact with one another on a symbolic, spiritual, or practical level?
Seraphim, I think you better take that.
Well, um, so I've got a family. They're upstairs, 4 kids, and I'm in my studio. So those things are interacting on a moment by moment basis right now. um, so I can hear all the family noise while I do my work. Um, I think I think my way of understanding the work of liturgical art is that everything that's part of my life, I guess any art, this would be true. Anything that's part of my life is part of the work. My kids show up in the icons. That's not intentional, but people will say, "Oh, this looks like your wife or your kids," and I think that's how it works in a way is everything that's inside of you has to come out or has to be part of creative work. But I don't know if I quite.
No, that feels like a good answer to me. Um, Otherwise, there's sort of a fracture in your life, so to speak.
Mm.
Dr. Tim, do you have any
Yeah, let me take a hack at this
insights?
as a
Okay.
non-artist, but as a writer, I think that certainly there were other books I wrote before The Ethics of Beauty, but I wrote them in some sense for myself, and so I never really pursued publication of those books. And um, so being part of a community at a college, or really being part of a friendship with Mother Nectaria, my editor and publisher, meant that whatever I had, good or bad, was at least gonna be shared. And now writing another book, this last month I've been at my sister's house, and a lot of family has come through for the holidays. Um, Certainly that you're humbled continually. You're reminded of who you are, and you can't sort of get too big for yourself. And I think that impacts, somehow the writing.
Yeah,
But
yeah. There's, eith- uh, yeah. I mean, if we're just talking about your life infiltrating your work, it's inevitable. Like, even if you try to suppress it, it's then you're just creating work that's about suppressing your life. The suppression gets into the work. There's no way around it. And then, and of course, like with family life, I ask my I ask my wife and kids about work I'm doing, but also I mostly watch how they respond to it, and
Mm.
that's the best feedback. Um, and especially my wife doesn't have an art history background. Um, Sometimes it's people who are not artists, visual artists, who can look at something fresh and just say, "Oh, that looks weird." Um,
I have that experience with my poems pretty frequently.
okay.
I think it's something spontaneous or erudite, or is making some sort of clever illusion. Generally, my wife doesn't like those ones very much, but she has a good eye for what other people will enjoy,
Mhm.
um, far more than I do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think as artists, we can get excited about things that are more about the art than about the people that are that the art is for,
Yeah.
and that's generally not a very good thing.
Do you feel like when you look at an icon from someone like Rublev or something, do you have a sense of like what his personality was like?
Hmm. Well, in a
Mm.
way, right, we canonized him based on that.
Right.
Nobody could imagine someone painting those icons if they um, weren't inwardly very pure and um, didn't have a great, devotion to God. And that's kind of a unique example, of we just lived with his icons long enough that we said, this man, whoever he was, must be a saint. Um, and yeah, probably. I mean, certainly his personality, his own personal quirks would have come out in there, and that's in a way like the the uniqueness of, say, if you're painting an icon of Christ, you need to use your own uniqueness to um, to add that element of uniqueness to the icon, or that's how it comes out.
How does that work with like? Is it the same when you look at, say, like a Renaissance master, a painting? Like, do you have a sense of the personality of the person as well? And do you ever think of that in terms of the theological or spiritual portrayal of, let's say it is a painting depicting Christ?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anyone who's creating something, you know, one way or another, their personality is going to get in there. It's not exactly that we could decode their personality from the art and sort of like map out their personality profile in a precise way, and it might be even more in just kind of like, if you see someone uh, walking around that you don't know, you can see some kind of pattern that's unique to them in just the way they walk and the way they look around. Um, there's some kind of a very, the way that artist moves their hand, or the way that they've, learned to control paint running around on a canvas, or whatever it is gonna be is gonna be personal to them. Also the medium that they work best with is has something to do with your personality. Um, just talking with Andrew Gould about some of the iconographers, are like, this one is better. He'd better avoid, extempore and stay with like wall painting because
Hmm.
it's more um, direct and um, rough, and the egg tempera, is more like delicate. Not that the same person can't do both mediums, but I think all that does happen.
I remember reading the animator Hayao Miyazaki. He was talking about how he could tell a lot about a person by the way they drew someone running.
Yeah.
I really liked that.
Yeah.
This kind of brings me to another one of the questions that I had prepared, which is, so you're a liturgical artist. I know you do some extra liturgical art, but for people who are extra liturgical artists, whether visual or otherwise, how much should they delve into regions that make them uncomfortable? Like Dostoevsky, famously has like episodes of very straightforward theodicy, and he brings up a lot of uncomfortable themes, of course, but there's like also a quality of his work that's very iconic, because he is depicting the human being like in such a wide brushstrokes, no pun intended, obviously, but
yeah. I mean, maybe I'd be curious what Dr. Tim's first take on that would be. Like, you're speaking specifically about liturgical art?
no, mostly extra liturgical art. I mean, just because liturgical art already has paradigms for you to fill. But if someone's writing a novel, or if you just sit down with a blank piece of paper.
Do you mean like sort of the danger of trying to inhabit a character who's doing evil, and in that sense of what risks to take, or
something like that, or like the value of depicting the whole range of human experience, from top to bottom, not necessarily leaving things out.
I don't think that the saints don't have that experience, and in this most recent trip that I took to Mount Athos, and just get a renewed sense that the most difficult situations people face, they're bringing to the Holy Mountain, and that they are hearing stories, or they're witnessing burdens that most of us might not see in a lifetime. They're seeing that every year, and then too, just in their prayer life, I think they have some personal, as their awareness of their own sin, or even of the world's sin grows, but with a personal identification, they partake of that. They have some experience of that darkness. I think it's, it might be harder for, an artist, let's say, who isn't. I think artists go in those worlds for us, but they probably, it's probably they do so at greater risk, and I'm still grateful for the risk. But yeah.
What do you think about more generally the relationship between art and suffering?
I was going to say with Dostoevsky, one of my heroes amongst iconographers is Leonid Uspensky, and his biography has a lot of striking parallels to Dostoevsky, including being stood up in front of a firing squad and pardoned at the last moment, and witnessing a lot of brutal war atrocities as he, especially I think as he fled the Soviet Union. But and so in Dostoevsky, he'll have it all depicted in his stories, these things. And of course Uspensky, an iconographer, isn't just, say, depicting all the nitty-gritty of human life in that direct way, but I do think that that same experience of suffering informs even, the lines and abstract qualities that Uspensky found as he worked on iconography. It's there, like you can. He couldn't have done that if he hadn't suffered deeply, and it's in a way it's there for people who experience suffering and interact with that icon in the midst of that place. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be that you paint a painting of war atrocities to get that across. I think it can be gotten across even in just the particular way that you depict the eyes of Christ.
Right. Dr. Tim, do you have anything?
Just this idea that we're not only made in the image of God, but of Christ in particular, and then somehow of Christ crucified and resurrected. And so it seems like pretty much everyone in the course of the years of their life on this earth, have a taste of that crucifixion, and it could come from many different directions, and somehow because that's the image we're made of, to grow into Christ likeness, that is a journey towards our own becoming more real. And I mean, I don't think certainly my ability to see, I can't tell if someone's faking. I mean, to talk about Christ is in a sense to paint a verbal icon of him. And certainly when I hear an elder talk about the person of Christ, I am persuaded that they know what they're saying. But it's not like I can as far as everyone else, I can be fooled, or I can be I don't think it's even a question of being fooled. I think that we can all have many glimpses of that, in a moment's suffering, and the suffering of a child, defeated at their birthday party from the gift they wanted, some deep disappointment. They might have a glimpse of really is an infinite level of suffering that they can call upon later in their art or in their attempt to be empathetic. Yeah, I'll just stop there, even though that's not a complete thought.
I like it. It's okay. So Dr. Tim, in another podcast, I quote mine to this. You said, "For the ascetic, the beautiful recedes until it abides in Christ alone." C.S. Lewis talks about how for him a certain piece of Norse poetry or a specific memory of childhood was an utterly numinous experience for him. But he warned that if people could recapture that specific instance or moment, they would be disappointed because the beautiful thing came through it. It wasn't the thing or memory itself. How do you navigate that tension as an artist or a writer, knowing the thing you make can be a vessel for Christ's beauty, but also just a thing? The relationship between maybe bad nostalgia and theophany.
Seraphim, if you want to go first.
Yeah, in a way, that's the big question, I think, for an artist, and for the big question to bring to an encounter with art, is that, I mean, in a way, right? It's the big question of living in the world, is things either being used as an end in themselves or being transparent to God. And I think iconographers that I know, some of my mentors, it's like the main task is to get out of the way, is to like to not put things in there that draw attention to, certainly to me as an artist, but even to themselves as art per se. I mean, there's no way to control like how someone's going to approach an icon or any work of art, right? But it is possible to say paint an icon. Say I develop all the skills, the technical skills to do this job, and I can make something that's just putting those on display. Like I can, you know, my icon can effectively say, all right, here's how I do this really nice line work. You know, I'm really good at painting a face. Look at, you know, this exquisite face I painted, and that can essentially become the content of the work. Not only is that possible, but that's very common actually. Probably a great deal of art in the world is like that. There's a whole movement called classical realism that is essentially, most of it is just people who have jaw-dropping skills, whose work mostly says, look at these jaw-dropping skills, you know. And or you can use those skills as a tool, and the aim of using the tool isn't to make some object. You know, there's an artist, Robert Henry, who has a popular book, The Art Spirit, who says that for an artist, the painting, he's a American painter from New York about 100 years ago. The painting is like a byproduct, and that the artist is kind of using these tools as a way to encounter your reality, you know, or ultimately encounter God, but encounter, you know, God through the world, and there's the search that you're doing while you're putting around lines and paint, and you know, the actual object that's formed by that search isn't the goal of the search, you know. I mean, you might be searching through, like, finding beauty on that surface, you know, on the wall or the icon board or whatever, but that's where I think that's the best way. And then if it's done that way, then the person who encounters it can be more of a conduit experience. Right, so I was wondering if you could explain your thought there on the relationship of iconography and the prototype, and what, if I remember, there's maybe a parallel between that and maybe like the succession of tradition in the church, or
Yeah, before we go to that, about this other issue that we're saying, what was it we were saying a moment ago before we
On nostalgia and theophany.
all right.
Just that I think that maybe it existed in the deeper past, but certainly since with the Renaissance, there's much more pressure on individual pieces of liturgical art to attain perfection. And then the definition of what perfection is, has changed over time. And whereas in a liturgical setting, every piece of art is part of some ensemble, and somehow that takes some of the pressure off, not completely, but it takes the pressure off the artist as artists, right? Like, because that journey that you described, Joseph, of going from the art to Christ, it's an emergent effect. it's the co-location of music and incense and art and architecture and I don't know what else, vestments and carpets and flooring and tile, and there's an emergent effect that takes us out of ourself and readies us for encounter with Christ. And when you take that icon out of that setting and put it in a museum somewhere, and then it's just you alone with it alone, imagining the skill of the artist, it's a different kind of a pressure in every direction, I think, that we're supposed to be a more complete art critic, that we're supposed to be, that the artist is supposed to be, a kind of, isolated genius. So there's a lot of things going on there. And even the theology of the church, where so much of it it's through the homiletic tradition, it's through sermons. And so even there, the original deliverance of that sermon, had all that support. Whereas now, it's principally, some really smart guy alone in there. When you read a book like Hymn of Entry by Archimandrite Vasilios, it's so the opposite of that, because it's a theological book about liturgy, and it's also from someone who, is an Athonite abbot and is so completely thinking symphonically and harmonically. But I don't, in saying that, I don't want to lessen. I know that, the pressure that chanters go through to try to master their craft perfectly. And I'm sure it's probably even more so with I'm sure it's more so with the iconographer, because you don't get that do-over. There's always another hymn when you're chanting. Yeah. What was that, Seraphim?
Yeah, the people have to live with whatever you come up with for a long time.
Yeah, a couple of centuries or more, like that.
Yeah. But we're kind of that you're kind of talking about two effects, because one is like the perfection, the artistic perfection of a given work, which, it's always better if it's better in a way, or maybe that's not, whatever the best way to do it is, it would be better the closer it is to that, on the one hand, which would include not having it be drawing too much attention to itself, etc. But then the other side is this cultural kind of expectation to encounter the art sort of face to face, or to like create a closed circuit between the audience and the art, which is more of like the modern way of approaching it, like we create theaters now, where it's like, here's me and here's the work, and you're face to face. You're in that more like, what is the work saying to me? Whereas the more ancient way of doing it is sort of like the art and me are on the same side of the equation, and together we're facing the world, or facing God in the case of, sacred art. That's we give tours of our church, and I try to kind of show the distance between the one and the other way of looking at it. Whereas, everyone comes in, they see the iconostas, and they think, why is there a wall right in front of us? And maybe they see Mary there and say, why is she the most important? And I try to say, like, this building is sort of like a microcosm of the universe, and also of your soul, and you're kind of walking around in both, and it's like the beating heart of the building is up way above you, and that's what is Christ in the center of the dome. And it doesn't mean you're staring up the whole time, it's just a different way of interacting with art. It's and you can create that closed circuit with good art or bad art.
So certainly, I think I think of certain paintings or the filmic experience in a theater, with the right score, and then God is an artist there too, because invariably a film is either showing nature or the human face. so so there's a lot of going on, and I often will have a feeling in both those kind of things, like, what's the last line of that Rilke poem? Something, you must change your life. Like, definitely have a very strong desire to renounce myself, and it's a kind of restless and pointless response, whereas the experience of art in the church, it's like there's this, I can renounce myself for some end, and it's a peaceful feeling. It reminds me of what Metropolitan John of Corcha used to say, that all great religions were founded at parties, and and I think his only real example was, that the Buddha was like at a wedding reception or something, and just says, okay, this is it. And but certainly, when I asked him about Christ, he said, oh, it was Cana. but I've had that experience at parties too, where you just suddenly feel in that experience of being there, I must completely change my life. And but the church is a different kind of party, where that's why that's why I've got to change my life at the other parties to get to this one. But what was there was something we were asking here before I said let's go back to that. What was the prototype?
Right.
I think we've, in a sense, Christ is a prototype of us on our spiritual journey. We fall in love with him, and we become an absolutely unmistakably formed to his likeness, and yet no two of us are alike. My niece is a monastic, and at the icon studio at her monastery, you can see that they come very close to these prototypes. They look exactly like so there it is not merely a model in that case. I don't know if that is, I don't know what it's like to be an iconographer. Would like to ask you about this, but is that an extra burden that it's easier to fulfill in a monastery to make, because those copies they are living. They are certainly unique because they're just a different piece of wood, and they're but they are on fire somehow.
Yeah. I mean, without seeing their work, I wouldn't know just what's going on in that particular case. But I don't think that the goal is generally to make something that looks just like an original icon or an old icon. And I think when you look at copies from ancient times or earlier times, there'll be something called a copy, and it's not a copy in the sense of having the same precise proportions, lines, shapes. It's generally a copy in spirit. So you'll see, here's the Vladimir icon, here's a copy. It'll have the same subject. It'll have Christ and his mother. They'll be touching cheeks, and in the same way, you'll see the bottom of his foot on one side. But the color, the kind of particularity of it can be a lot different. So I don't know. I think that kind of precise copy is a more modern phenomenon. and it's not bad. If it's living, it's living. If it's on fire, it's on fire. There's no like rule about that.
And I assume someone, I assume someone who knows art better than I, and painting far better than I could see, some subtle change. And I guess in the book, I guessed that, maybe this is part of an apprenticeship that, to try to, and I gave, I analogized it to jazz, learning jazz masters, note for note.
Right. You mean like if you were try to play a jazz master's music by just playing it note for note in a copy, it wouldn't sound like jazz per se, right?
I suppose it could, but that's not going to be the heart and soul of your repertoire anyway.
Right.
Like you're always going to go on. I guess a classical pianist, it's different, right? Like there, it really is. They are adhering to the prototype, but still somehow managing to invest it with a life,
Right.
that someone else who gets it accurately, just cannot. And in my experience in just many milieus of life, it really is. It's very hard to quantify the living from the non-living, except that through sustained exposure, you start to know, and then when you run into it, there is some inner relief that you feel, like when you when you're in the presence of that.
Yeah, and I think that's, in some way the living, well, it's based on love, so there is no formula. You can't, if you set up a formula, it's gonna kill it, like if you say, if I do X, Y, Z, and it's I don't know where you're going with that word apprenticeship, but that resonates in terms of like an apprenticeship. I studied as an apprentice kind of in the old world way. I had an opportunity to do that for my whole sort of what would have been my college years, and it's more of a matter of you internalize your teacher. They kind of come to live inside of you, and then, like, I feel like my teachers are still in there teaching me and guiding me, and that kind of flow is still kind of like coming out over time, and that's, I think, a good image of how to interact with prototypes is to like drink deeply from the great, beautiful icons or works of art, and let them live inside of you, and then it's like learning a language. Then you're able to speak with that language over time, and it's not that you're reproducing those things. My teachers wouldn't want me to just do versions of their work, but you can see them. You can even kind of, I can see how they, like, their teachers were flowing through them, and it's...
George Steiner, I think he was French literary critic, he talks about learning things by heart. And, when you learn something by heart, it actually reconfigures your personhood to a certain extent, like you allow it to become part of you. And then, as you're saying, sort of your uniqueness in whatever medium it is then shaped, but in a really like organic and unforced way by the great things of tradition. So I think that's cool. And also, the end of Matthew B. Crawford's book, The World Beyond Your Head, he spends a long time, I can't remember where he was, with a group of organ makers. And he recounts that there were sounds that they were able to hear when they were tuning organ pipes that he literally was unable to hear. And after spending like a few months with them, he started learning how to hear what they were talking about. But before that, he just was like, there's no difference. You're playing the same thing. So I've heard people say, for instance, with pianists, like you can have a computer play what have you, but like a really experienced piano player will be able to tell like the softness of, the fingers on the keys, the breath, everything like that. And there's like this imperceptible difference that's really interpreting the work again, and it makes it theirs. Like obviously Yo-Yo Ma's cello suites, right? Those are like their own thing, kind of apart from Bach even. People are like, it's Yo-Yo Ma. And what's happening there is interesting to think about, I think.
Probably you long for a student like that, that can take your work and show you what it means, but it's not that they didn't know, but that, they they receive something quite precisely, but which has an even greater depth, that. I feel like anytime I give a podcast, I have to say the words Jane Jacobs. But in her book Dark Age Ahead, she made this point about cultural institutions that, in the end, a culture is transmitted from teacher to student, or from prototype to and an institution that loses the feel for what the master had suffered or went through to get that, is just kind of a dead man walking. It's no longer the same thing. And so really, AI can't do this as far as we know. I mean, it never will. But conveying things like that, like sounds that can't be heard, or the flow of the master.
Yeah, and I like to think, even if you could do a study and X% of the people couldn't tell you, well, this was a human and this wasn't, or something like that. Even so, those people are getting that value from listening to the real human thing, even if you can't define and put your finger on it. If you haven't been trained to hear those sounds that take 3 years to train to hear, they still benefit the person who encounters them. I think this is like something that I think artists in general get, probably when you're like going through an excruciating editorial process writing, and somebody will say like, nobody will notice those small changes that you're making. I hear that a lot when I'm belly aching about, is this, just the right color? Maybe I should change it. And I think even if, they wouldn't come in and say, like, recognize that particular small change that took a lot of energy to make, but still that it gets to the person somehow, like that care that's put in is still transmitted, even if you haven't been trained to recognize it precisely.
Yeah, there's something to that with like what you were talking about with the disappearance of the medium too. If it's perfect, then people almost won't notice it. It's when there are imperfections that people get pricked by it. But if I'm imagining like if your composition, you're using all of the colors correctly in a certain way, it wouldn't be noticeable, because it would be, it would have an internal resonance that would just make it feel natural. Maybe I have one last question, which is about mostly pertaining to extra liturgical art. the right use of the imagination. In patristic Naptic literature, fantasia and stuff is usually sort of calumniated for very good reasons. But I feel we have examples of paintings. Nestorov came to mind, and of works of literature that are imaginatively amplified, like George MacDonald, Lewis, people like that. So in your maybe personal experience as someone who works in actual liturgical art as well, what's been the favorable approach that you've found?
Well, maybe I can start by asking Dr. Tim, is it, when I hear this kind of question about, so there's the imagination as discouraged, especially like when monastic teachers are teaching about prayer and don't use your imagination, etc. And then when we just talk about the imagination, like we're artists and we use it, I feel like we're almost talking about two different things. I don't know, is that accurate?
Oh, I never thought about that before, really. Is it I mean, we have different faculties. Is it permissible to imagine but not with the noose or something? If you're
I think in like St. John of Damascus, to my knowledge, it's a power of the soul that can be rightly ordered. But when you're engaged in like pure prayer, so to speak, then the tendency is for it to be not have a telos. Whereas if you're crafting something, then it becomes like you need to have be imagining. And I know Father Solomon Justiniano has talked about theophanies, the Greek, and the way he would compose icon programs, basically from memory in churches. But
I feel like it would be impossible to go through life without using imagination, just in the sense of calling up an image, or like when my daughter loses her hairbrush, I say, use your imagination.
Sure.
Because she needs to like remember where she put it. Oh, I was in this room. It's like you need to be able to picture what's going to happen just to take the next step, usually in any kind of activity.
Right.
Like I need to be able to imagine that the car is going to turn on when I put the key in and turn the key before I go through before I do that,
Yeah. What do you think's going on when people do elaborate an imaginal world, like McDonald's Fantasties or something, anything really, it really has like its own grammar, and in order to write that novel, or maybe like really give the contours of it, there's a level of like one's inhabiting that's going on there that's different than maybe just calling up an image.
I mean, I feel like this answer is like too like simple just to say that to everything there's a time and a season, and we're trying to get to that point where in prayer it's imageless and we can sustain that for a long time. But I saw a quote from Saint Iakovos Tselikis from Evia. He described being an experience of the uncreated light, where whatever he desired to know, the light was pure information, he said, and within it, whatever he desired to know, he instantly knew. So it was this connection between love and knowledge. First was perfect, and there was no need for imagination because it was just knowledge. It was an actual thing. So certainly we want to, and all would be lost for Orthodox if the unknowing in prayer was not the core, and the imagelessness of prayer was not the core. And the images of the icons are the fruit of the imagelessness. And Orthodoxy is at once the most imageless of Christian faiths and the most image rich. And that's the thing. But I think there is a danger that it can get hard to go to imageless prayer if we're spending just tons and tons of time, let's say, watching movies or something. Like, it takes a long time to like step into the liturgical setting and detox from that. Or maybe detox sounds too negative, but it is what it feels like, right? But I think we are just created people, and we're not. And I was with a cousin, my cousin once in Berlin, and we were at an Orthodox church, and it was a long journey from her house to the church. And when we got there, we were way too early. It was a Sunday morning, and so we were there like before Orthros, all of Orthros. And what she liked best about the experience was that the two women just on the other side of her were in deep prayer for all of Orthros and about a third of the way through the liturgy. And then they just had enough. They were full. There was no more to be gained. And they just talked quietly to each other throughout the remainder of the service. And it was so quiet that I was just one person away. I didn't notice it. It wasn't disturbing anyone. But to her, that was the sign of an authentic worship, that they were completely in God, and then when they had enough, they had enough. It wasn't like they felt they had to go to church and fake it.
Yeah.
That's always stayed with me. Her very charitable and I think wise, evaluation of that it was a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, I like that. Well, do either of you have any concluding comments, questions, anything like that?
Yes.
All right. Well, we can wrap it up then.